Welcome everyone to the Over Under Movies podcast, the show where we take a prominent figure or franchise in the world of filmmaking and ask the simple question, is it overrated or is it underrated? My name is DeAngelis. I'm joined as always by my co-host. He is the Jar Jar Binks to my Qui-Gon Jinn. It's because you're the key to everything. Is Mr. Jason Gong.
Thank you. I'm very honored to have that title.
Jason, we have a very, very special episode here today. So we have a full cast ready to break this one down. Why don't you introduce our guests for us?
Yeah, I'm super stoked to have these guys here. To preface this, these are two of my favorite people in the city, some of my dearest friends, but I'm going to introduce them with the same names I have them as in my phone. So this is Nic Improv and Caroline Trivia.
Yes, I love it.
Yes, thank you guys for being here. Why don't you guys tell us more about yourselves? You can say your real last names if you want.
I'll go first. I'm Caroline Juelke. I'm a person who works in entertainment. I don't know how to describe myself anymore. I used to be an actor, but now I work in music, and I really love nerdy things, so I'm ready to talk about Star Wars.
Awesome.
Hell yeah.
I'm Nic. Last name, mysterious. I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Thanks, Nic. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, we appreciate you guys coming on this podcast today. We are talking, of course, about the Star Wars prequel films with May the 4th coming up, as well as the 25th anniversary of the release of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. That's right. It was 25 years ago for everybody that wants to feel old right now. So these films, they were released between 1999 and 2005. So we have Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, all directed by George Lucas. These movies are very interesting to talk about in regards to overrated, underrated right now, particularly because the overall sentiment of these films has kind of evolved over the years, right? When they first came out, people didn't really like them. They were considered a failure. Side effect of these movies flopping to an extent, George Lucas becomes disenchanted with filmmaking in general and corporate big suits, so he just sells it off to Disney for $5 billion or something like that, some ridiculous amount of money. After the Star Wars sequel trilogy, which culminated with the all-time classic Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, people kind of went back and reevaluated these prequel films and are maybe they weren't as bad as we thought they were. So this is going to be a very interesting conversation for us today. Jason, you and I rewatched all three of these films in the last week or so. It's a very interesting experience. These are films that I've watched plenty of times. I'm sure you watched them plenty of times. What was a big takeaway from you after this recent rewatch we just did?
It's kind of the same stuff that I've been sort of feeling about it the last couple times I've rewatched it, but I think Episode 3 is a pretty goated Star Wars film, and then I think Episode 2 is maybe the worst Star Wars film. The jump in quality is huge there, and it's interesting to see. But even though Episode 2 is really bad, it also set the stage for those Clone Wars series, which I haven't seen all of, but those are pretty beloved. So even the bad stuff in these movies kind of lends itself to creating good stuff, which I think is really interesting. And yeah, there's just really basic stuff that I just go hype for every time, like Duel of the Fates or the double-bladed lightsaber. Just great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Jason told me that you were also rewatching the films. Did you manage to catch all three of them leading up to this?
Yeah, I finished the third one today. I've seen them a million times growing up, and the prequels are the ones that I've probably seen the least out of them. So every time I watch them, it's I'm kind of watching them for the first time because there's always something new that I find when I'm watching them. And I agree. I think the third one is easily the best, and the first two feel kind of just lead us to the third movie. They don't really have enough going on to be movies themselves sometimes, and they feel like fan serve before fan serve was a thing.
So it sounds like the consensus on the panel so far is the first two are not very good, and then the third one is pretty solid. Nic, would you agree with that?
No, I'm a Phantom Menace.
You're a Phantom Menace person. Let's go.
Hell yeah.
Tell us about Phantom Menace.
I think what I really like about Phantom Menace is its density, which I can get why people aren't crazy about it because it hits you like a brick wall. Kind of like you said, I do feel like every time I revisit it, I find new elements in it that I hadn't really thought about before. I think because of how much of it is dialogue focused. And there's a lot of double crossing and changing plans and things like that. There's a lot of to pay attention to when you're really digging into it.
Yeah, it's really political, and I think if it was done better, it could be Game of Thrones-esque with all that political intrigue going on. I just think that it's kind of confusing to follow, especially for a kid. And then even now when I watched it, I was, like you said, it hits you kind of like a brick wall.
Yeah, it's a hell of a flex from George Lucas, like going for this like political intrigue story with this prequel film, with Phantom Menace specifically, because like, yeah, A New Hope is so streamlined. It's such a tight movie, even though it was not always a tight movie for anybody that knows like the behind the scenes of A New Hope. Not a very good screenplay that was fixed like while they were shooting it and then really fixed in post, and now it's considered like an all-time like beloved movie. Phantom Menace, putting all of those like political machinations into the movie when, like, let's be real, Star Wars is a children's fantasy movie series. You got to imagine that like kids weren't latching on to like, you know, the Trade Federation and like the blockades being in like the opening crawl of Phantom Menace. Like, I don't think really, you know, people really stuck with it all too much. This movie was the highest grossing film of 1999, an absolutely stacked year for movies. Jason, do you think that like the lasting legacy, the Phantom Menace and the prequels, is going to be like these are the films that were like the hard turn for Star Wars, like when people started getting like the real negative sentiment about it?
No, I think the Disney buyout is what like history will say is the negative turn. I think for a lot of like Gen X fans of Star Wars, you know, they were talking a lot of shit about these movies a little bit after they came out. And there was kind of like a critical reevaluation, you know, between their release and like the Disney buyout where people kind of turned on these films. Because if you look at the critic reviews, they're not that bad across the board for these. But I would say that for the most part, yeah, like there's enough of a swing in the pendulum back the other direction where a lot of younger fans really like these movies. And I think like most people agree that the sequels are kind of bad and that a lot of the TV series they're putting out, there's just like too much of it. So I would say the Disney era is where the saturation point really hits.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of like the revisionist history comes in with the prequels. I mean, like which side of it do you guys fall on? Do you prefer the Disney trilogy or do you prefer the prequel trilogy? If you had to pick one.
I'm the contrarian that likes the Disney trilogy better.
Yeah, same.
And so what is it about like the prequels do you think like might not hold up as well as, you know, the recent Disney stuff?
Oh, it's the CGI. It's so terrible. And like all the animation of Yoda and like all the battle scenes are just so corny in a way that like the rest of Star Wars isn't. It takes you out of it and it just puts you to like, it just puts me off so bad. But it works for the clones. So it's like, it's good in some ways, but I think that's why the Clone Wars TV show works more than these movies do, because they can lean into like the things that you can only do with animation that these movies maybe would be better if they could lean more into, because they couldn't do the practical effects as much with like the droids and all that. So
I think I'm mostly just really into how deeply sentimental the sequels are. I think there are definitely elements, more like emotional elements that go a little underappreciated in the sequels. I think those movies really dig into the Force as a metaphor for emotion in a different way. And I think there's a lot of stuff that like themes, the redemption and the fatherhood stuff is much more upfront in those, which feels very like activating. So I think my preference for the sequels has more to do with my appreciation of the sequels than my not liking the prequels.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the CGI because that's something I really noticed upon like this recent rewatch is like the CGI looked really bad in Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, which funny enough, both those movies were nominated for Best Visual Effects at the Oscars. Revenge of the Sith was not. George Lucas, basically like around like 1980, 81, when like he realized that like this is going to be a thing. Star Wars is going to be like all consuming his life, basically. He kind of set like a roadmap for himself that he was going to make 9 Star Wars films. That was going to be his story. And that after the first 3 that he did, he was going to do a prequel trilogy. And then he was going to do 3 films that kind of like wraps things up after Return of the Jedi. The main holdup for him, though, was that he wasn't sure if like visual effects in movies were advanced enough for him to be able to do what he wanted to do with the prequels. His company, ILM, was working on Jurassic Park in 1993. George Lucas' friend Steven Spielberg. He really liked the effects in Jurassic Park, and he was like, these are really good. I think we can actually make my Star Wars prequels now. And that's when he really started getting into active development into Phantom Menace. Though when you look back at the CGI in those films, like Phantom Menace in particular does not look very good. And we can compare it to like other films that came out around this time. I mean, this film came out the same year as The Matrix, and we're like a year or 2 away from the Lord of the Rings films, which completely hold up nowadays when it comes to visual effects. So it's curious, like ILM is such a well-known company for like really, really good visual effects that like, yeah, the CGI just does not hit the same for those films.
Hold up every time you rewatch it too. You're like, oh, this is way worse than I thought it was.
I will say, funny enough, like Revenge of the Sith looks really good. Like there's like a giant jump between 2002 and 2005 when it comes to like overall quality. Jason, I guess like from like the narrative side of things, like do you think like, you know, the political intrigue of the prequels like holds up better than like the Disney films, or is it just like you think the highs are higher in the prequels than with the sequel trilogy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the highs are higher, and I think that the political stuff is generally more well thought out in the prequels. I think with like Rogue One, the political intrigue and the spy stuff is really good. Like in the third movie, when the Jedi Council asks Anakin to spy on the Chancellor for them, I thought that was really well done. You see like his inner turmoil from it, like, and that kind of blends the political intrigue with the emotion of the film. I thought it was all pretty good, yeah. So narratively, I found that stuff pretty compelling.
How about the acting performances? The acting performances in the prequels have always been like panned, except for Ewan McGregor. People have always seemed to love Ewan McGregor, though in this rewatch, I really appreciated Natalie Portman's performance, especially because like, you know, she's pretty young in Phantom Menace, and you see her like grow up as an actress as well as this character. You know, not a lot of actors are in all three of these movies, and I think by the time you see her death at the end of Revenge of the Sith, like, you know, you feel for it. You know, it's a real like send off to that character. Unfortunately, like she doesn't get as much like agency as I feel like, you know, she should have as a character. I'm sure there's like a level of like, you know, sexism like in the screenwriting in that part, because Padme has like way more stuff to do in the Clone Wars series. Like she gets like actually kick ass. Also, like Revenge of the Sith specifically, there's a ton of deleted scenes with Padme doing like political dealings like behind the scenes. They cut all that shit out. It got cut down to like one scene in the theatrical release. So I was curious, are like any like acting performances that you guys think are like standouts that are like underappreciated by general audiences?
I think the acting overall is kind of better than it gets thought of as. It seems like it's mostly the Anakins that are kind of the problem. I think everybody else is pretty dialed into the tone of the thing, which is like mild camp, I guess. But yeah, Ewan's perfect for, I think when you like really thinking about individually who's in them, like Liam Neeson and Samuel L. Jackson, Christopher Lee, I think there are like a lot of performances that hold up when separated from the central performances.
Right.
Yeah. Well, on this rewatch, I finally realized, I was like, I think I get why they cast, why can't I remember his name now? Anakin. Hayden Christensen in this movie. And I think it's because of his chemistry with Natalie Portman, specifically in the second movie. Like the scenes that they have together, though they are just staring at each other most of the time and there's very little dialogue, they are good. Like they do a good job, but that's probably the only time he does any good work in these movies. But
the scene where she kisses him, they both are really delivering.
Yeah. And like the one where they're in the field with the, like, I think it's very believable. Like I believe these two people are in love with or falling in love with each other, and he's pined over her for years or whatever. But otherwise, I feel like they should have had him read more lines for other scenes, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, Jason. We were talking about it a little bit when we were watching it. Like, I feel like we got to give Padme some flack here for the litany of red flags she's ignoring with Anakin. He comes off so fucking hard immediately. The first time he sees her in episode 2, he's floored it on the gas.
He says, I've thought about you every day for the last 9 years. Yeah, it's crazy. I do think that the actors had good chemistry. I agree with you guys. I just think that romance dialogue that George gave them was not very good. And yeah, like Dylan, like you said, there's a lot of red flags, not the least of which is that Anakin murders a village.
Yeah, he commits Tusken Raider genocide. And she's like, I'm so sorry about what happened to your mom.
Yeah. She had a chance to back out of that like relationship that was clearly, you know, doomed by the stars. There's a lot of chances she could have had to not start that in the first place, but that wouldn't have been the story. I also liked Hayden Christensen's performance in the third movie when he's yelling at Obi-Wan when they're about to fight.
Someone gave him an acting lesson between 2 and 3 for sure.
Thank God. Yeah. He had 3 years to learn how to act, and I think those lessons took. His scenes with the Chancellor, I don't think were like great. Dylan, you said every time he was like supposed to spy on the Chancellor, he folded immediately.
Yeah, he has the worst poker face ever. When he's like, the Jedi want you to spy on me. And he's like, yeah, they want me to spy on you, man.
It's nuts. But yeah, by the time he has that like pretty iconic dialogue with Obi-Wan at the end where he's like, I brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire. And then they fight. I thought all of that really worked emotionally and it was badass.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the main conversations that people have around these films is Hayden Christensen and Jake Lloyd. In Phantom Menace, they have such a young Anakin that they're introducing you to. Like, would it have been better to have an Anakin that was like Natalie Portman's age?
Yes.
And never have kid Anakin, because like Jake Lloyd is not, I mean, he's a kid, so it's like, you're criticizing a kid here, but he's not very good. Every line he's delivering flat, and it's tough because he's such like, he is the central character of these three movies. It kind of makes that first movie like kind of a wash. It's almost like you're being introduced to Anakin for the first time when you first see him at Attack of the Clones. Nick, I know you're the Phantom Menace guy here, so what did you think of Jake Lloyd?
I actually was just thinking about a scene where I do think he is pretty good is when he's saying goodbye to his mom. He similarly has moments, and I like him being as young, or I like the story starting with him as young as he is, because part of the point of the thing is uncovering his vulnerability, I guess, like watching the transformation of an innocent, which, yeah, you wouldn't have been hit as hard with if he was already into puberty or something.
Yeah, I think the issue comes from like, you're missing so much of like those transformative years from him, right? And like, I really felt it on this rewatch. Like when you meet him in episode 2, he's clearly like really like angry, like all the time. And when you see him in Phantom Menace, like you don't really see that in him yet, though I'm sure that's something that's like developed over the years, but like we never got to see those. Like there's a really significant time jump between the two films. So yeah, for me, like I would have preferred like, young Hayden Christensen if they were able to like go back and do that all over again.
Or even just a kid that was like a little bit older. Like 2 years would make all the difference.
Yeah, originally.
Like, he looks like he's like 7 in the first movie, and then he comes back and he's like teenager, I think.
So in the original script, they had him as a 12-year-old, so he was a little bit older. He's 9 in the movie that we got. I forget what Lucas's reasoning was for aging him down again, but I kind of agree with Nick that like if you want to see that full transformation from like an innocent to space Hitler, you're gonna have a more dynamic arc if he does start off as a little kid.
I just wish we saw how he got to that a little bit.
Yeah,
more.
I feel like we should have gotten like a beginning, middle, end thing though with the prequels. Like Hayden Christensen feels like very similar between 2 and 3, even though there's like a 3-year gap in those releases. So yeah, like it's so jarring when you go back and like watch Jake Lloyd as Anakin, because it almost feels like a different character.
Mm-hmm. It feels like part of the motivation is his attachment to his mom. I guess that's the whole idea. And they could have set that up a little bit more in maybe the second half of Phantom Menace. Something about him like missing his mom and being motivated to frustration over it or something like that. But it's kind of like not spoken about at all for the whole second half of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, Phantom Menace is a bit of a mess of a film. One of my favorite quotes from Red Letter Media's review of Phantom Menace is Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi should have been combined into one character called Obi-Wan Kenobi. Why is Qui-Gon Jinn like a thing? What is the requirement for him? Is it just we need like Obi-Wan to have a master that gets killed off at the end of the first film?
The way he seems to explain the Force does feel outside of the way the rest of the Jedi are talking about it in the beginning. I think the first scene, they're kind of going back and forth, him and Obi-Wan, about whether to keep your mind on the present or on the future. Stuff like that like him being positioned as an outsider, I think maybe he's meant to show some way that the Jedi as an organization has strayed from their original intention or something like that. They're not as chill anymore as they could be.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it feels to me. Like their disagreements, I think, are what feels relevant about him.
Yeah, he's someone who brings a different point of view than the council, and he kind of sasses them a little bit. I think that's a good way to show that the Jedi aren't like a singular monolithic type of organization. So
I think we can agree that like the Jedi are shown to be like profoundly incompetent in these 3 movies.
yeah.
Like, if anything, these movies show like the Jedi Order just like fucking sucked at their job. You have like one job, and that's to keep like Sith Lords away. And there's like a Sith Lord that like assumes power throughout all three of these films. And then when it comes time to take out the Sith Lord, it's like a 4v1, and two of you get murdered in a second. And another guy, he lasts like 2 swings. And then Samuel L. Jackson, who, like, I actually think Samuel L. Jackson is really good as Mace Windu. Like, he's an actor that he's really campy, and a lot of the roles that he takes, he's like openly said like he just likes making money as an actor, so he'll take whatever role. He'll take Snakes on a Plane, like he doesn't give a shit. But he's like really serious in these movies, like he's going for it. And by the time like he has that fight with Palpatine in Episode 3, like he looks pissed off. He looks like he's ready to fucking kill the Emperor. I thought it was great. And then, yeah, Anakin just like folds like a little bitch immediately. He's like, no, we can't kill him, despite like what, an hour and a half previously, he beheaded Count Dooku. So Anakin was totally cool with killing people.
Yeah.
He grows a conscience only when it is for himself, which I guess is the point, because he's the ultimate villain of the entire storyline. So of course he would, but it just feels so unearned. Like, they can justify it, but should we justify it?
I guess we could talk about Jar Jar real quick. He's the key to everything. That's not my quote. That's a direct quote from George Lucas. Clearly, he was not a very good key because everybody hated Jar Jar Binks. Jason, a little bit of racist aliens in these prequel films.
Yeah.
I did not introduce you as Newt Gunray in our introduction to the podcast. That might have been a little bit too heavy-handed. These are definitely like racist caricatures in these aliens, right? Can we say that like for sure?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure just based on the accents that they give them and the mannerisms and stuff and the wardrobe choices. Yeah. I mean, fantasy racism was different back then. It wasn't a talking point like it is now. And yeah, no one really called it out at the time. And it's kind of gotten grandfathered in as like, yeah, that's just part of
Star
Wars.
Sweep it under the rug. They're like, it was 25 years ago. Like, who cares if Watto is like, he's just a Jewish guy.
Yeah, it's
and he loves money.
it's interesting.
They're like, it can't be racist if it's in space. You're looking too far into it.
They're like, what do you mean the Trade Federation are like Asian guys? They're the Trade Federation aliens. It's crazy. It's crazy to look back on that and like they just got away with it. I guess like all the other problems that these movies have, like the racist aliens are like 15th on the list. They're pretty far down. Let's talk about some of the good stuff in the films. The music, John Williams, really good, right? Jason, is Duel of the Fates just like the best movie track like ever? Like, it's undefeated, right? Every single time Duel of the Fates pops up in this series, it's goated, right?
Yeah, it's goated for sure. I think other contenders might be He's a Pirate from the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. And that's it. Just those 2 songs are the best soundtrack songs of all time.
And the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers theme.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Also.
Of course. Yeah. But yeah, Duel of the Fates is really good. Like, it gets you amped up, but it's also, I get like a weird nostalgic emotion every time I hear it at this point. So it works on like a lot of levels. I would say even like there's a song called Across the Stars, which is the Anakin Padme love song from the second movie. Like, that movie sucks, but that song is awesome. And it really does make you feel like that longing for another person that these 2 characters are supposed to have for one another. So yeah, John Williams is really doing his best to like elevate these films.
Without the soundtracking of all of these movies, it takes it fully into the camp territory, I think. And that's what brings it back into like, no, this is a serious movie. Like, and we're doing serious things and this is political intrigue. Otherwise, like, it does get a little silly, especially in these movies when you have like Jar Jar Binks running around and like all like every line that C-3PO says the whole time, but then it like fades into the most beautiful soundtrack you've ever heard. And it's like, oh yes, now it's time for more serious space things to happen.
Speaking of C-3PO, what do you guys think of like all like the retcons that happen in these movies where George Lucas feels the need to give like backstories of like characters and things that like we don't need to learn about? Anakin builds C-3PO in Tatooine, and then like R2 is just like a random droid that managed to like survive like fixing a ship, so they just like hang out with R2 the whole time. Is that just like fan service? Is it like bad screenwriting, or is it fine because it's campy?
I have no real opinion on it, which feels notable only because I remember watching these movies as a child. and not having an opinion on that, like one way or the other. I think it just like I didn't even like think to notice it, I guess. And I'm also like, now I'm kind of thinking more about the way people talk about that kind of stuff with more recent movies, where often I will just not catch it.
Well, it's something that's such a big thing now in the Star Wars films, where everything is like, I've got a bad feeling about this, or, you know, they've got like a random like cantina alien that like shows up in the background of some scene, and you're like, oh, I know that guy. Or you need to have like a whole like Boba Fett Disney Plus series, even though it sucks. You know, like riffing on like old stuff that people thought was good and like nostalgia for the early films is kind of like the calling card of Star Wars. That's what it's become, unfortunately. It's funny you mentioned that about the droids. George Lucas has openly stated that like these films are kind of told through the perspective of the droids. They're not like the main character, but they're like almost like the protagonist. That like we're following the story with the droids as they go through it. It is hilarious that they wipe C-3PO's memory at the end of episode 3, so that explains why he doesn't remember anything once A New Hope comes around. They don't wipe R2-D2's memory though, so that guy's just lying. He's just keeping his mouth shut.
I kind of like all the like fan servicey things. I mean, I think this trilogy was for the people that watched it as kids to show their kids, so it's a fun thing to, or at least that feels like what it is for a lot of people around like our age growing up, because these were maybe the first Star Wars movies you watched, or like you watched them and then you watched these immediately after. So it's fun to be able to like watch them with that nostalgia, even if you don't have that nostalgia of those original movies, because you feel like you're in like a group if you can like catch the little details that they throw out there, especially like literally every single C-3PO line in these. All three of these movies feel like some sort of like callback to the original ones, which you wouldn't know unless you're like paying attention, because they could just be lines, but it's a fun thing, I think, to be able to catch them.
Yeah, for like the droids specifically, it is kind of a nice way to tie things back to the original trilogy, because like with the other returning characters like Obi-Wan, he's like a completely different guy. But the two droids are just the same guys that you know from the original trilogy, and they just get introduced in these weird random ways. But I think for like most of the things that you're saying about seeing a random background character, like it doesn't really work. But for the droids, because they're that sort of like Greek chorus to the story, it is kind of nice to just see them again and have them serve the same function that they do in the originals.
So I feel like we've buried the lead a little bit, like talking about these films, like the individual aspect. Like the films in general, though, like we generally don't think are very good, right? So Jason, what doesn't work about these movies exactly?
The first two are just kind of like sloppy story-wise. The second movie especially, like it goes for something really cool by splitting the story into two parts. It's like Anakin hanging out with Padme and having a romance. And then Obi-Wan goes on this like detective noir story where he has to like go talk to his contact at the diner. At the
50s diner in Coruscant.
Yeah, it's like, so the idea is like he's doing a send-up to like the Maltese Falcon or something, except that gets dropped like 40 minutes into the film as soon as he like gets to Camino, where he I guess solves the mystery, but not really, and they never really explain the mystery. They say that they introduce the idea of a character named Sifo Dyas who commissioned the clones, and then they never explain who that is or why he did that.
Never mention him again except for like 2 episodes of the Clone Wars series.
Yeah. So yeah, like there's a lot of good ideas in these movies, and then just a lot of like dropped ideas and confusing plot points and just stuff that's really hard to follow.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like the plots, they're trying to be so not what the second trilogy does, of like repeating the original trilogy, that they don't have a plot to the movies then, because they're like, oh yeah, do that because we did that in the original, so we have to do something totally different this time around and make it a love story noir movie. Even though that's not the genre of movie that they're trying to actually do at all. It just doesn't work. It's clunky.
Yeah. What do you think, Nick? I know you like these a lot.
Well, I think by the mid-90s, what we now think of as standard Hollywood story structure was really becoming solidified. And I think at that time, you were mostly seeing it in the Disney movies that were coming out. like Aladdin and stuff. And I think that was pretty exciting then. The Matrix really does that. I mean, I think a lot of that stuff is just the first Star Wars movie. It's almost sort of funny that like Force Awakens has gotten all this criticism for being too similar to the original Star Wars, when it kind of feels like everything now is too similar to the original Star Wars. And people are also like complaining about it all the time today. Not just in this, but like all blockbusters across the board are now kind of like playing with the same sort of structure, which is not bad, because I think if you can really normalize expectations, that really like opens you up to play with other ideas or whatever, kind of diversify the concepts more if you're not playing with how to hold people's attention in the same way. So there's like, I don't know, good qualities and bad qualities to it. But the reason I brought all that up is that I do kind of feel like part of the frustration with the prequels, especially at the time, I think is drawn from how much we're used to the same structure and how things that stray from it feel foreign and strange, even though it's something that's kind of socially constructed by us adjusting to the same beats all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lack of like good 3-act structure going on in these movies. Jason, we talk about all the time about not liking movies that are super long with bad pacing. All of these movies are like 2.5 hours long, and boy, do they feel it. They feel very slow at times. You know, I think part of it is due to the poor dialogue that George Lucas has written. Like, if there's not a lightsaber battle or some other like, you know, interesting action sequence going on, you kind of find yourself dozing off a little bit, or in your case, you're scrolling TikTok. Yeah, it's interesting because the sequel trilogy, the main issue that they had in those films is that they, for some reason, Lord only knows why this happened, they did not have like a plan laid out for those 3 films going into them. Like J.J. Abrams wrote a first film, and then they handed it off to Rian Johnson and was like, hey, make another movie that's like a sequel to this. And Rian Johnson was like, no, thank you. And then they had to like put the pieces back together in the 9th film, and it was a disaster. However, these 3 movies are all done by the same guy. They're done by the guy, George Lucas. He clearly had like some sort of idea laid out for Anakin's journey here. So like, why didn't it work from a story perspective? Or I don't know, maybe you guys think that it works like overall. You know, the prequel trilogy is essentially the journey of Anakin Skywalker turning into Darth Vader. And actually, I think like overall that works pretty well. It's almost like a situation of you use the wrong equation, but you got the right answer with like the end of these 3 movies. But I don't know, like where do you think like the cohesion got lost here with all of these? I know you like them, so maybe you can start like what I'm guessing you think they work together really well.
Well, now I feel weird about how I'm getting stuck as the person who likes them, because I do like them, but it's also kind of like I appreciate how weird they are, or not. Even weird's not the word. Different, because that's kind of what weird means. I appreciate how different they are. I guess I kind of think familiarity is a little overrated, perhaps. Like maybe I would like to see, like I appreciate that it is taking swings. I mean, that's
yeah. What's interesting about the prequels is that like these movies kind of like spawned the first generation of like YouTube video essays on like movie deep dives. My favorite movie review channel, Red Letter Media, they did a 90-minute Phantom Menace review that went like super viral, and it was like the first one that like did like a really, really deep dive into a movie like this. And there's people that are like on complete opposite sides of evaluations of these films. There are people that are like, George Lucas is an idiot. He made 3 bad movies and he completely killed this franchise that, you know, was sold for billions of dollars, and, you know, Disney had to like try to like pick up the pieces from it. And there's people that are on the complete opposite side of it who say that George Lucas is a secret genius and that he's playing like 12D chess with the way that he is like mirroring his storylines between his different movies. If you go online and just look up like graphs breaking down like the similar elements of like all the different Star Wars films, there are people that legitimately think that George Lucas is some sort of secret genius and he's not like a guy that's kind of like making it up as he goes along. So I'm curious, Jason, is George Lucas a secret genius, or is he a guy that made like 2.5 bad movies?
No, I think
and had to sell off his franchise.
Just a fairly competent writer-director. that came up with a story that's fun. And I think like the real thing that makes him a winner is like his design ideas, like the idea to come up with lightsabers or to make Darth Maul look like that. And Darth Vader, pretty much all the Darths. Yeah. Like, that's really his secret sauce, is that his designs are good. We were trashing the CGI earlier, but like every design for those bad CGI things is cool and iconic. The droids, they don't walk in a very realistic way, but they look cool.
They also have banter.
Yeah, which is really funny.
I like the banter.
Yeah, I don't think he's a secret genius, but I think he is good at the things that he likes doing the most when he directs these movies.
So you think he like unfairly got all the flack for these films? Because like there's a documentary that came out, I think in the mid 2000s, called The People versus George Lucas, which basically just like documented like Star Wars fans completely rebelling against this man, talking about like how much he killed this franchise with these 3 movies. I mean, is that fair or not fair?
I actually watched both that and the Red Letter video this week to prepare for this, because I wanted a sense of like the cultural energy around the thing, which is kind of what I think I also really find interesting about these movies, is that like even if they're bad, the reaction is so intense that I can't really believe that people are solely motivated by their dislike of the movies. And I think the way they usually say it is, Star Wars is really important to me as a fan, and I've put all this energy into the thing, and it's like a betrayal to drift so radically from what the original films were. And I like don't buy that. I don't buy that like that's the sole motivation. And they really fit into an interesting time in the development of the internet, and of like you were saying, of like voices on the internet and like content creators and things like that.
Yeah, Star Wars in many ways is like the first online toxic fandom that we have around like a movie series. We see a lot of that nowadays, but like Star Wars was the first one, and particularly with the prequels, like all of us were kids when the prequels came out. But for people that were kids when the original Star Wars films came out, you know, they were like middle-aged when, you know, these prequel films came out. So I feel like that group of fans felt like a sense of like entitlement to the Star Wars franchise. They weren't ready to like let it go and give it off to like the kids that thought that Darth Maul looked really cool in the lightsaber fight in Phantom Menace, right? They were like, oh no, this is not the Star Wars I grew up with. This isn't the Star Wars I loved. And they were like, it's because of George Lucas. Like he fucked this up.
I think it's like people get mad at him for it, but they're not recognizing the underlying issue that the Star Wars movies, at the end of the day, I think are for children too. And that they're all, you can show any Star Wars movie to a kid and it's okay. So like, they're not kids movies, but they're appropriate for kids. So I feel like when George Lucas is making these movies, that's what he's trying to think about. And I think that makes adult Star Wars fans angry because they want it to be for them forever. Mm-hmm. And they can't get on board with the fact that it's maybe this one's maybe not as much for you. And like, you have to learn to appreciate where it's at now and how it's for a different group of people.
Yeah. I mean, it opens like a wider conversation to just like identity-based consumerism, where like people really, everyone tries to find like a subculture that they vibe with, or a group of subcultures that they vibe with, and then that becomes who they are. And, you know, we live in a world where people will sell you your identity, you know, for profit. And Star Wars is one of those things where, you know, we've got our merchandise here and it decorates our house, and it's like, this is who we are. We want people to see that we like Star Wars.
Yeah, they have Star Wars Land. Have you seen how much it costs to build your own lightsaber at Star Wars Land?
How much is it?
It's a lot.
It's like hundreds of dollars. I went to Star Wars Land last year. It's very cool as someone who likes Star Wars to get to walk around. You genuinely feel like you're walking around the sets of the movie, but it is a price gouge at every single turn. Like, you can go to the cantina, but you have to book it out, and you can't just walk in. You have to reserve your table, and if you want to sit for longer, you got to pay to do it.
If you want your blue milk for $25.
It's very Disney-fied, and it's cool that we can have that, but at what cost?
Yeah, but I think that explains part of like the entitlement that these people, like these fans, feel, is like they probably are shelling out a lot of money for this merchandise and stuff, and they're like, I've bought and I've paid for this to be part of my identity, and now you've put Jar Jar Binks into it. Why would you do that?
Like, why do you put this like goofy character in a Star Wars film? Like, Star Wars isn't goofy when like they're not like realizing what they're saying.
I mean, I also think nowadays there's a lot more discourse around the way the internet can become echo chambers that can then become like conspiracy theories or something. It feels like any idea can somehow find life on the internet, and I don't really think we tend to talk about the like Star Wars and also Lord of the Rings, that kind of like pre-Lord of the Rings just sort of had a similar energy before the movies came out. I mean, we don't really talk about it in that light, but I do think that light is relevant in hindsight. Like now that we know what the internet can do to people's brains.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and hopefully with our panel here, we've got diverse enough voices where we're not just echoing the same stuff. I think we're bringing some good perspectives. But
well, it is unfortunate because like I mentioned that documentary, The People versus George Lucas, really the people won in that case because George Lucas has not directed a movie since episode 3. He's probably never going to direct another movie in his life. He basically sold off Star Wars, and like now he just like makes a lot of like donations to like USC Film School and like other like small like film organizations, and that's it. He said he's going to make like small like indie films like for himself that like nobody will ever see, and then he'll show up to a Star Wars celebration every like 5 years and wave at people, and that's it. And it's kind of sad, right, that like this guy that made this franchise, he's considered like one of the greatest American filmmakers of all time. He'll have like not actually directed that many movies. Most of the movies they directed will have been Star Wars films, and people kind of hate 3 of them. It's kind of unfortunate. I mean, do you think like his legacy in particular, like people are going to look back on it like positively, even if they don't like particularly like the prequels?
Like you said, they're for kids. I do think he was really well intentioned with these because it feels like his goal was to kind of teach kids about politics and about like philosophy and like prepare kids to think about that kind of thing. So I think there is also something like socially that's lost in it, that it does sort of feel like culturally we're moving in a direction towards acknowledging the significance of stuff like that more. So maybe people will come back for it in that kind of a way.
Yeah, because like I mean, the political side of these films, basically the message is like don't trust your leaders, and the whole like Palpatine subplot is about the rise of fascism in the form of like a charismatic leader who gets appointed chancellor and then refuses to leave office during wartime. It's something that is like pretty relevant to like current events. So I could definitely see like, the prequels like kind of coming back around in that sense. But again, that's like a thing that like, like kids aren't going to focus on that stuff at all. They're just going to they're going to be swiping TikTok anytime like a scene in the Senate's going on. So it's kind of, it's weird. Like I appreciate George Lucas going for what he's going for here, but like, in my head, there's like an hour and 45-minute version of like all of these films. It's just tighter, and they just like cut out some of the fat, and like overall, they probably could have fixed a lot of the problems here.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about your question of like how will people feel about George Lucas, I just want to poll the panel like yay or nay on George Lucas. Nick?
Yeah,
definitely.
Dylan?
I'm more the Red Letter Media guys have the opinion that George Lucas is the luckiest person in the history of Hollywood, and I like half agree with that. He made this like relatively low budget fantasy film that just fucking exploded, and there's no way he could have ever predicted Star Wars becoming what Star Wars became. And he's a guy that like in a lot of ways is propped up by like the people around him. He had ILM, like this like all-time legendary visual effects studio that just like comes out of Lucasfilm, and he's got John Williams. He's got like an all-time legendary composer who's making all the music for this stuff. He's got a lot of great people around him, and if you ever go back and like watch like the behind the scenes of the prequels, George Lucas doesn't seem exactly like locked in. Like if you watch, for example, like Christopher Nolan and like behind the scenes stuff, or like Denis Villeneuve for like the Dune movies, like you can tell like those guys like they really give a shit when they're out on set. Like they're not like micromanaging, but like they're really getting on top of it. And like George Lucas, he seemed so excited when he could just like sit in a chair on a soundstage doing the prequels. Like everything's blue screen, and he's just looking at a monitor, and he's like, "Yeah, that take was good. All right, next one." And so I'm a little, I'm somewhere in the middle.
I mean, you kind of said it though. He sits back and says, go, but he also surrounded himself with all these incredible people. So maybe he is smarter than we all think, and like he really did. He cracked the code. He realized he didn't have to do that much if he just Hayden Christensen to the side, surrounded himself and put the best people to the task.
Well, that is part of the reason why the actors have come out and said that like George Lucas didn't give them a lot of directions when they were shooting these. They would do like 1 or 2 takes for everything, and he'd be like, all right, that's good, next one. And so like the actors who are good actors are good at the movies, and the actors who aren't good actors come off bad in the movie. Like he's not, nobody's like, punching above their weight class in the acting department with these movies for him. So it's tough. It's tough to say. I would like to see George Lucas do more movies. Hopefully, this is not the last we've seen of him. Any final thoughts from you guys for the prequels before we get into our objective rating here?
Nah.
For now.
Beautiful. All right. So before we get into overrated or underrated arguments, we need to come up with an objective rating out of 10 for where the consensus is for these movies. This is going to be a tough one. Jason, I'm going to start with a 5. What do you think?
Cool. So yeah, the way we do this is we are trying to think of like how the general public views these movies. We factor in like critical scores, critical reviews, and then like, well, what do my friends think of this?
Yeah, so Rotten Tomatoes, Phantom Menace is 52, Attack of the Clones is 65, Revenge of the Sith is 79. Metacritic was 51, 54, 68. All 3 of them had an A- cinema score, which is not good. Even though A- sounds good, it's not good. Yeah, they actually reviewed better than I thought they were going to review, having looked back on these.
Yeah, the only surprise for me is that Phantom Menace is rated like significantly lower than Attack of the Clones. I think nowadays people have kind of come around on the Phantom Menace and don't like Attack of the Clone that much.
Yeah, I would definitely rank these 3, 1, 2 if I was ranking 3 of them.
Yeah, me too. It's tough to say. I mean, some of these critical reviews, like Roger Ebert gave Phantom Menace 3.5 stars out of 4, which is like really high for him. And then people, they kind of like these movies when they came out. That's what I was saying earlier. It's like there was revisionist history happening like between 2007 and 2010 where people were like, these movies actually suck.
It's gone back and forth like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. So it's hard to like... It is tough. I think I'm with you at a 5. I think
this is really tough.
Still like these, and half the people hate these.
This might be like straight up the hardest like rating we've had to like put on something here. It's really difficult. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think they're like pretty middle of the road, just because there's so many people that love them, and then there's so many people that absolutely hate them. So we just have to come together in the middle. And like the critics' scores are high because of the whole CGI of it all. Like that was good for when it came out. I mean, there's better movies that were around that time, but like it wasn't as bad as if you're trying to give it a unbiased review right now, looking at what could be done. It's hard to compare it, so you kind of have to like go with what actually happened at the time when they came out.
I also think it's interesting how much attention they've gotten, even by people who don't like them. The way they like fixated on it, it did become kind of an MST3K thing where they were memed and quoted. Like I think even people who haven't seen the movies could probably quote a lot of lines from these movies that everybody supposedly doesn't like.
Yeah, there's kind of a so bad it's good element to them.
Yeah, it's like when you're a child and you like have a crush on somebody, but you don't like want other people to know that you have a crush on them, so you just kind of like bully them. That's sort of how at least like the memification of the movies feel. They're like, it feels like not only is it hard to come up with an objective rating because of how much the opinion varies, but it also feels hard because it seems like there's so much contradiction within individual people.
Yeah, these are such interesting movies to talk about, regardless of like their overall quality, which just like inherently makes them interesting and also makes them like rewatchable. Like I don't think I've seen The Last Jedi since the first time I saw it in theaters, but like I've seen Phantom Menace like at least a dozen times in my life, and like I was pretty okay like coming back and like rewatching these. Like I don't mind rewatching the prequels every now and then. though. Like when we do our sequel trilogy podcast, because we're splitting these up into 3 podcasts, that one's gonna be a little tough on rewatch.
Yeah, we'll have to bring you guys back. I didn't know you were both Disney era stans of Star Wars. But yeah, we'll see you back for that one.
So we go on 5. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, so our objective rating is 5 out of 10. Now the fun part, Jason, you have underrated.
Yeah.
So why are the Star Wars prequels underrated?
I think that the prequel saga as a whole really does feel epic in its scope and
You're reading off a script. What's
storytelling.
happening here?
Listen, the third movie really slaps. And even though the second movie is weak, it does a good job setting up the sandbox of the world, leading to massively successful projects like the Clone Wars series. Like, a lot of good stuff spawned out of this, including the fact that Disney wanted to buy it and keep making it. Like, these were good enough movies that there was so much to build off of that it's still pumping out content today. I think you have to mention how cool Duel of the Fates is and the double-bladed lightsaber. Like we were saying, like when the audience first sees Darth Maul extend one side and then the other side while Duel of the Fates is playing, that's got to be like an all-time cinema moment if you're like watching that movie in theaters.
Yeah, you rewatched that sequence like a day after we watched the movie, right? I heard you. Our TV room is like right next to my bedroom, so I heard Duel of the Fates when I was like on my computer. It's like, is Jason rewatching this?
I was watching something, yeah. Like I said twice now, these movies were not like reviled when they were released. They got that kind of criticism a couple years afterwards. So, you know, talking about like all these people who do think it's overrated, like that was them kind of going back and trashing it after comparing it to the movies that they grew up with. And I think they just got a really bad rep during that period of time. You asked earlier what we think of like the cohesion in Anakin's journey. I actually think it's pretty good because like Nick said, it starts with him and how much he loves and is going to miss his mom. And then it's about like she dies. So he gets this fear of death and lack of control over life. And that's what leads him to the dark side. I think it all works and it all culminates to like the ending of that third movie, which I think is like great. To me, the ending of the third movie is like the peak of Star Wars, because it perfectly bridges like that prequel trilogy to the sequel trilogy, with a ton of like emotion behind it. It's just really fun to watch. And yeah, I think that these movies had such a long period where they were getting trashed on, and it was really unjustifiable in my opinion. And I think they're just better than like a 5 out of 10 rating.
Okay, so I have overrated. The first rebuttal I gotta say here is that just because like good stuff spawned out of this doesn't mean that this is good. It makes me think of when I was in college. I was an architecture major, and as architecture majors, you do you'll do like a building design, and then you'll like pin it up to a board, and you'll have like a jury of like architectural professionals look at it. And the conversations that were the longest were always the projects that had the least amount of stuff on them, because the people on the board would have to kind of like fill in the blanks and like figure out like what was going on with like the rest of the design. Like the designs that were like well crafted, like well put together, the conversations were much shorter. And I think that's kind of like how it's been with the prequels, is that there's so much stuff that like goes unexplained in these movies that you can like spawn an entire animated series that talks about like why Anakin and Obi-Wan are like best friends when episode 3 comes around, because that's never explained. But you're like, oh, you can go back and watch, 5 seasons of the Clone Wars, which is all, that stuff happened like after the fact. The main overrated argument here does come from like, the revisionism to the revisionism here a little bit, right? If we were given this podcast 5 years ago, I'd have a harder argument for sure. Just go on YouTube right now and look up like the prequels weren't as bad as you remember them or something like that. You're going to find a dozen video essays of people breaking this shit down. I think we've kind of like beaten around the bush a little bit here in this podcast that like these are not good movies. Just like straight up, objectively, they're not good movies. Subjectively, you might enjoy them and there might be like interesting parts to talk about, but just as like regular movies, if we're trying to judge them in a vacuum, they're not good. The movies had 5 Academy Award nominations between the 3 films together, which is not very good. That's like less. It's like half of what the first Dune movie got nominated for. You would assume that like Star Wars movies would just like sweep nominations for technical categories. It was not the case. And basically, again, this is like John Williams like putting this franchise on his back when it comes to like Oscars. It for some reason, Revenge of the Sith should have been nominated for Best Visual Effects. I'll give it that. When we're talking about like box office wise, the Phantom Menace was the highest grossing film of 1999, which is great. 1999 was a huge stacked year for movies. It made 1.027 billion at the box office, which is a monster for 25 years ago. And then we get Attack of the Clones. How much did Attack of the Clones make at the box office worldwide? It made $650. It made $400 million less than Phantom Menace. That's a pretty like quick turnaround from like Star Wars fans being like, we don't like these movies and we don't like these movies like immediately. Like they didn't even give them another shot. Revenge of the Sith is a little more. It was in the 800s at the box office, but people turned away from these movies very fast. I think part of that is just because like they're not good. People like us that were like kids when these movies came out, like you're always going to have the memories of like seeing Darth Maul in a movie theater for the first time, something like that, or seeing the Anakin Obi-Wan fight from the third film. They're great moments, but if you take like 10 steps back, these movies are not very good. And anyone that's trying to convince you these movies are actually good is they're smoking a little copium, I have to say. Obviously, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but I think generally speaking, yeah, these movies they're overrated. It's incredible that you can consider them overrated now because of, you're right, at the time, especially like the mid-2000s, nobody liked these movies. They were considered like all-time flops. But nah, I definitely think they're overrated nowadays. What do you think?
Well, the problem with your numbers, with your $1.x billion is that is including the 3D re-release in 2012. If you had clicked on the little asterisk next to the box office number, you would see that The Phantom Menace has been re-released like 5 times in theaters.
It's being re-released now, too.
It's being re-released in a week on May 4th. They were going to re-release all 6 movies in 3D, and they only got to the first one. But yeah, about $150 million off that $1 billion number you have comes from that. So that gap that you described of $400 million is inaccurate by like almost half. But that's just numbers. I think that these are good movies. You said that objectively they're not. I think that like 1.5 of them are. The third one I think is good all the way through. And then the first one ends with the Duel of the Fates sequence. So it's awesome. What do you guys think?
I totally agree. I think they're underrated. And I think that as I was like watching them, I was writing notes for myself. And at the end of like the last 45 minutes of every single movie, I just kept writing, this is the best movie ever. Like they get so good at the end of them. The beginnings are rough, I will admit. Mm-hmm. The dialogue throughout is never really great, but there's so much to love in these movies, and there's so many good things, especially at the ends of every movie. All the battles are awesome. Like there's so much good in them that I think we really trashed them for a long time, and I think it's time for us to all agree that they're not as bad as we thought they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sense that they're underrated does come more from a desire to see a more inclusive idea of what is counted as good, I guess. Like a wider range of values. I mean, like a big thing for me, I guess, is that they do try to throw a lot of politics in there. And like, I think the Phantom Menace being about like a dispute over the taxation of trade routes, I think is a plus and is good and cool, actually.
It is a wild way to start this trilogy. Like that's the first thing we're doing is the Jedi breaking up this blockade.
I mean, I think the idea that like a movie has too much dialogue and therefore is boring, there are a lot of like all-time old school classics that get the same criticism today, and that kind of stuff is what is influencing these movies.
And ultimately, these are so campy. Like when things turn to camp, it's hard to say, oh, well, it's objectively bad, or it's like it's falling into these bad things because it's a camp version of those old classic movies that were all dialogue. So it's not bad. It's referential and it's good, I think.
Yeah, the one thing I really noticed on rewatch here, it kind of made me like depressed a little bit, because the overarching story of these three films is watching Anakin Skywalker be the chosen one, and then he has his fall from grace and turning into Darth Vader. So it's a chosen one that is not actually a chosen one. I know it comes back around by like the end of the sixth movie, but like Dune 2 came out this year, which is a very similar like plot thread of you have a guy who is this mythical chosen one. However, it's like a fake out because he's not actually the one that's going to save the day. And when I look at like this movie versus Dune, I'm like, it's no fucking contest. Dune is so much better than this, even though they're trying to do basically the same thing. And like George Lucas he's getting sunned a little bit by Denis Villeneuve, who, funny enough, Denis has like multiple times now has said he hates dialogue in movies. That if he could write a movie with absolutely no dialogue, he would love that. Like what do you think, like having like seen Dune, and like I'm sure like after the third Dune film particularly, you're gonna look at the Star Wars prequels and be like, yeah, that's like the kid version of this.
Yeah, but I mean, like Caroline was saying, like it's hard to make that comparison when the level of camp is involved. Like, yeah, Dune is a much more serious and maybe more efficient way to tell a very similar story, but Star Wars is doing its own thing, and it's like very different. And in terms of like rewatchability, like you were saying earlier, I think if I had to rewatch either the Star Wars prequels right now or the two Dune movies right now, I would probably pick the Star Wars prequels. Like they're infinitely rewatchable. They're fun. Dune is a little heavy. So I don't think that we can glean too much from comparing those two. They are like big sci-fi space operas. But yeah, I think that you can't say that this is bad because Dune is good.
So I guess we can get into our verdicts now. Final thoughts. We're outside the realm of debate here. Jason, do you think we've come to the conclusion that these films are definitely underrated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're pretty underrated. I still think they get a lot of hate from like another generation of fans that is unwarranted. So I would say it's underrated. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think they don't deserve all the hate. So if we'd set it at like a 7 or an 8, I would have to think about it a little bit harder, but I think they deserve more than a 5 out of 10, you know?
Yeah.
I think this one's really complicated because it really depends on the person and like what kind of like Star Wars fan or like what generation of Star Wars fan you are, whether or not like you're going to have the perspective that these are overrated or if they're underrated. Like if we're just trying to come like out of some sort of consensus here, it's tough because the general mindset has really come around on these movies in recent years. 10 years ago, yeah, they're definitely underrated because people were shitting on them like crazy. But now, like, we're almost getting back around to the idea of like 5 might be like properly rating them. That might just be like hit the nail on the head. Like sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. So, you know. Like the Force, you want to be balanced. You want to be right in the middle there. You see what I did there?
Yeah, good. Very good.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to take the coward's way out. I'm going to say properly rated. Okay. 5 out of 10.
Yeah, we rarely do that, but that's fine. So, all right. So most of us think it's underrated, and you're sticking with properly rated.
Yeah, God help us for whichever one of us pulls underrated for the sequel trilogy films. That's going to be a fun...
We can just let them do that.
It's going to be a fun...
Yeah, they can team up against us. I think that's fine.
That'll be fun. We haven't had enough opportunities to do like a 2v2 where like me and you were in the same team.
Yeah. We should have looked at doing that this time. But yeah, when are we doing the sequels? Like
I don't know.
2 years from now?
Yeah, do we want to do it every May the 4th or do we want to do Star Wars again?
I'd hope we're still friends in 2 years.
But yeah, I think that's going to do it for our Star Wars prequels podcast here. Jason, thanks once again for coming on.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to our 2 esteemed guests. You guys were great.
Do you guys have anything to plug?
No.
That's my favorite answer.
There's always no.
Our friends are opening a improv theater. It's called Side Quest Theater in Philadelphia. They got a show coming up on May the 4th.
Oh shit.
It's called Step Right Up. So if you're in Philadelphia, go see that.
We'll put any relevant links in the description of this video if you want want to check it out. And check out all of our stuff. You can find us on Twitter, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Pod, wherever you get your podcasts. We release new episodes every Monday. If you want to get our episodes a little early, you can join our Patreon page. Patrons get episodes 24 hours early. You also get your name in the end credits of every episode. Did I miss anything? I think we're good, right? Check us out on TikTok. I'm trying to upload more TikToks and like shorts, podcast clips, all that good stuff. That's whatever the kids are into these days. Anyway, for myself, for Jason, for our guest, that's going to do it for this episode of the Over Under Movies podcast. We will see you at the movies. Peace out. May the force be with you. Shit. May the force be with you. Okay.
And also with you.